Someone says something. It's small, but something inside you ignites. A feeling of warmth rises through your chest, your jaw tightens, your thoughts begin to race. It's that old familiar feeling. You've been affected again. Welcome to our channel. If you've ever wondered why certain people or situations have so much power over your emotional state, this video could profoundly change your inner life. Before we continue, if you value content that transforms your deep psychology, subscribe to the channel and leave your like for our journey through Carl Jung's teachings. Why can't you just let things go? Why do their words control your emotions? Why do you keep ruminating, reliving that situation for hours, sometimes days afterward? Carl Jung, one of the greatest psychologists of all time, had a brutal answer to these questions. An answer that, when truly understood, has the power to make you emotionally untouchable. Not through indifference or coldness, but through something much deeper. And here's the truth that hurts the most. It's not the people or situations that are affecting you. It's something inside you that's screaming to be seen, healed, and what you're about to discover is the map to your own emotional liberation, directly from Carl Jung's deepest insights. Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. This simple phrase from Carl Jung contains the first profound secret to freeing ourselves from the emotional influence of others. When something someone says or does deeply affects you, your mind immediately creates a story. They are making me feel this way. They are the cause of my suffering. This is the primordial illusion that Jung identified as the root of all unnecessary emotional pain. What's really happening is much deeper. That feeling of warmth rising, that sudden irritation, that anxiety, it's not about the other person. It's a coded message from your unconscious saying, "Here, look here." There's an unhealed wound, an unacknowledged truth, an unintegrated part of yourself. To understand how this dynamic works, consider this true story from one of my patients, identity altered to preserve confidentiality. Joanna would become deeply irritated when her co-worker received praise. No matter how much effort Joanna put into her own projects, seeing someone else being recognized made her furious. Most traditional therapies would tell her to practice gratitude or reaffirm her own value. But Jung would have a completely different approach. He would ask Joanna to turn inward and ask, "What is this showing me about myself?" By doing this inner work, Joanna discovered that she grew up in a family where love and acceptance were conditional on performance. She had internalized the belief that her worth as a person totally depended on external recognition. That's Jung's brutal revelation. The people and situations that affect us most are actually our greatest teachers. They are revealing with surgical precision exactly where our psyche is still wounded, fragmented, or deluded. In modern neuroscience, this phenomenon is explained by what researchers call neural mirroring. When we observe others exhibiting qualities or behaviors that touch on our own internal insecurities, the same neural circuits that process these emotions in us are activated. It's as if our brain can't fully distinguish between self and other in these emotionally charged situations. A 2017 Harvard University study demonstrated that people with greater self-awareness and self-compassion showed significantly less activation of the amygdala, the fear center in the brain, when exposed to criticism or social rejection. In other words, the more you know and accept yourself, the less the external world can affect you. The first practical step Jung recommended was what he called trigger mapping. When you feel emotionally activated by something external, stop and ask, "What is the exact emotion I'm feeling?" Name it precisely. When was the first time I felt this same emotion? Seek the earliest memory. What belief about myself is behind this reaction? Be brutally honest. This simple process begins to break the illusion that others are the source of your suffering, revealing the true internal pattern that needs attention and healing. The shadow is that which you think you are not. This enigmatic phrase from Jung contains the second crucial principle for emotional freedom. When you feel inexplicably provoked or irritated by someone, it's usually not the person themselves causing the irritation. It's what Jung called shadow projection, one of the most revolutionary concepts in depth psychology. The shadow, in Jungian psychology, is not simply your negative aspects. It's everything you've repressed, denied, or refused to acknowledge as part of yourself, both the dark and the golden. These are the parts of you that were thrown into the unconscious because at some point you learned they were not acceptable. Here's the fascinating mechanism. Everything that resides in your shadow, you cannot see in yourself, but you will instantly recognize, and often with a strong emotional reaction, in others. Dr. Robert Johnson, renowned Jungian analyst, explains this brilliantly. What you don't acknowledge in yourself, you project. And then, paradoxically, you become controlled exactly by what you're trying to avoid. A classic example. The man who is extremely critical of lazy or undisciplined people is often repressing his own desires to relax and not be so hard on himself. His shadow contains the lack of discipline that he doesn't allow in his conscious self-image, so he projects that shadow onto the world and becomes deeply irritated when he sees it in others. Modern science is beginning to validate this Jungian understanding. A fascinating study published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology demonstrated that the personality traits participants most rejected in themselves were precisely those that provoked the most intense emotional reactions when observed in other people. This explains why certain people can instantly irritate you, while not affecting others around you. They are, without knowing it, touching exactly on the parts of yourself that you haven't recognized, accepted, or integrated. Jung discovered that this shadow projection mechanism is responsible for 90% of our interpersonal conflicts and emotional disturbances. The good news is that, once understood, this same mechanism becomes a powerful tool for self-knowledge and liberation. A transformative exercise that Jung frequently prescribed for his patients was the irritation inventory. It works like this. Make a list of 3 to 5 people who irritate you the most currently. For each person, note the specific traits that bother you. For each trait, sincerely ask, how do I express or repress this same trait in my life? Psychotherapist Robert Bly describes this process as eating the shadow, reabsorbing the projected parts of ourselves. When you recognize that your irritation is a precise map to your own unintegrated parts, every difficult encounter becomes an opportunity for healing and wholeness. As Jung wrote in his private diaries, it is not by suppressing the shadow that we free ourselves from it, but by making it conscious. When you begin to see your reactions to others as messages from your own unconscious, you are already on the path to authentic emotional immunity. Individuation. This single word contains Carl Jung's deepest secret for true emotional freedom. It's such a revolutionary concept that even decades after its formulation, few truly understand its transformative importance. Individuation is not about becoming an individual in the common sense of the word. It's the process by which you become psychologically complete, integrating all the fragmented parts of yourself, including those we project onto others and that leave us so vulnerable to being emotionally affected. Jung discovered that people who naturally progressed on this path of individuation developed a quality he called psychic integrity, an inner stability that made them practically immune to external manipulations, criticisms, or opinions. This is not a state of emotional isolation or arrogance, but of authentic connection with all parts of yourself and, therefore, with others. When you are no longer at internal war, you don't attract or feed external wars. An illuminating example of this principle comes from the life of Viktor Frankl, who survived Nazi concentration camps. In his book, Man's Search for Meaning, he describes how prisoners who maintained a sense of internal purpose and connection to their values remained psychologically intact, even in the most brutal conditions imaginable. They had reached a level of individuation that protected them from being completely destroyed by the external environment. What makes individuation so powerful is that it resolves the fundamental conflict that makes us reactive, the tension between who we really are and who we think we should be. A 12-year longitudinal study conducted by the Institute of Analytical Psychology demonstrated that people who significantly advanced in the individuation process showed not only greater psychological well-being, but also biological markers of lower inflammation and reduced stress response. In other words, psychological integration translated into measurable physical resilience. Unlike superficial approaches of positive thinking or emotional control, individuation doesn't try to suppress or manipulate your reactions. Instead, it seeks to understand and integrate the internal polarities that create these reactions in the first place. Jung described 3 essential stages in this process: confrontation with the shadow, recognizing and accepting the parts of yourself that have been denied or repressed; integration of opposites, reconciling the internal polarities, mind, body, masculine, feminine, rational, intuitive, that created conflict and fragmentation. Connection with the self. Establishing a conscious relationship with the organizing center of the psyche, which Jung called the self, different from the ego. A practical exercise to advance in individuation is what Jung called active work with symbols. When you feel emotionally affected by someone, visualize the situation as a theater scene. Now imagine yourself playing the role of the person who affected you. What would it be like to be in their shoes? What would you say with their voice? What motivations would you have? This role reversal exercise activates what modern neuroscience calls the brain's default mode network, the neural circuits associated with empathy and self-understanding. By temporarily assuming the perspective that is provoking you, you begin to integrate the polarity that created the reaction in the first place. As Jung said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Individuation is precisely this process of bringing to consciousness what was unconscious, transforming reactivity into conscious choice. Breath is the bridge between the conscious and the unconscious. This observation from Jung points to a frequently neglected dimension of his work, the connection between body and psyche as the foundation for emotional stability. Jung, far ahead of his time, recognized that reactive emotional states are not just psychological phenomena, but also physiological states. When something or someone affects you emotionally, your nervous system enters a state of fight, flight, or freeze, and your ability to remain centered is severely compromised. This understanding, which Jung developed through his own experiences of emotional instability, led him to incorporate specific bodily practices in his therapeutic work, an aspect of his teachings rarely discussed in academic circles. Jung observed that conscious breathing had a direct effect on a person's ability to remain emotionally stable when provoked. He theorized that breathing functioned as an anchor for consciousness, preventing the person from being completely dominated by automatic reactions. Contemporary science has confirmed Jung's intuition. Researchers at Stanford University discovered that certain breathing patterns activate the vagus nerve, the main communication pathway between the brain and the parasympathetic nervous system, responsible for restoring calm after stress states. Dr. Stephen Porges, pioneer of polyvagal theory, explains that when we learn to regulate our physiological state through breathing, we create a neurological platform for emotional safety. This state of neurological safety is precisely what allows us to respond consciously instead of reacting automatically. Jung developed a specific technique he called circular breathing to help his patients maintain emotional stability during challenging interactions. He observed that this practice, when consistently applied, created a kind of energetic shield that allowed the person to remain present and conscious, even when provoked. Here's the modern version of this Jungian technique. When you feel you're being emotionally affected, become aware of your breathing without trying to change it initially. Observe where in the body the feeling of disturbance is strongest, usually chest, throat, or stomach. Visualize your breath flowing directly to that area, imagining the air as a light that gradually dissolves the tension. After 3 to 5 complete breaths, allow your exhalation to become slightly longer than your inhale. Count to 4 as you inhale, to 6 as you exhale. Maintain this pattern for at least 90 seconds, the time needed for the nervous system to begin the transition from a stress state to a state of balance. A study conducted by the HeartMath Institute demonstrated that this simple practice of conscious breathing not only reduces amygdala activity, the brain's fear center, but also increases heart coherence, a physiological state associated with mental clarity and emotional stability. As Jung wrote in his clinical notes, conscious breathing creates a space between stimulus and response, and in that space lies our freedom and power. This simple practice, when applied the moment you begin to feel affected, interrupts the automatic cycle of reactivity and restores your capacity for conscious choice. Either you possess your psychology, or it possesses you. This direct observation from Jung brings us to the final and perhaps most transformative principle for freeing ourselves from the emotional influence of others. Jung identified 2 fundamentally different states of being: groundedness and reactivity. The difference between them determines whether you will be constantly affected by the external world or maintain your emotional sovereignty. The state of reactivity is characterized by identification with passing thoughts and emotions, external focus, what others think, say, or do, feeling of being pushed and pulled, by external forces. Decisions motivated by fear, insecurity, or need for approval. The state of groundedness, on the other hand, is characterized by witness awareness of thoughts and emotions, internal focus, values, purpose, personal truth, feeling of stability, even in challenging situations, decisions aligned with personal integrity and inner wisdom. Most people oscillate between these states, but Jung observed that those who were rarely affected by external provocations had cultivated the ability to remain consciously grounded, even under pressure. This distinction has been validated by contemporary research in neuroscience. Dr. Richard Davidson, from the University of Wisconsin, discovered that individuals with advanced meditation practice demonstrate significantly higher activation in the left prefrontal cortex, the brain region associated with emotional stability and resilience, when exposed to provocative stimuli. What makes this discovery so revolutionary is that it suggests groundedness is not a fixed personality trait, but a capacity that can be developed through consistent practice. Jung developed a specific exercise to help his patients cultivate this state of groundedness, which he called anchored presence practice. Adapted for the modern world, it works like this. Several times a day, especially before potentially challenging interactions, pause for 30 seconds. Feel the weight of your body in the chair or your feet on the ground. This literal physical sensation of groundedness activates neural circuits associated with safety and presence. Breathe deeply into your lower belly, what Qigong practitioners call the dantian. Visualizing your roots extending deep into the earth. Silently affirm, I am rooted in my own truth. I can observe without absorbing. As you enter the situation, keep 10% of your attention on the sensation of being grounded, while 90% engages in the interaction. What makes this practice so powerful is that it activates what neuroscientists call executive monitoring networks in the brain, the neural circuits that allow us to observe our own reactions instead of being completely absorbed by them. A study conducted by the University of Toronto found that people who regularly practiced some form of body-based mindfulness demonstrated greater activation of these executive monitoring networks and, consequently, less emotional reactivity when provoked. As Jung wrote, "Free is not who does what they want, but who knows who they are." This is the essence of groundedness, a connection so deep with your true self that the opinions, judgments, and behaviors of others lose their power over you. Not because you've become insensitive or disconnected, but because you're so deeply connected with your own truth that you no longer need external validation or approval to feel complete. We've reached the end of this journey through Carl Jung's deepest teachings on how to free ourselves from the emotional influence of others. Let's recall the 5 transformative principles we explored. First, we recognize the illusion of separation and how our emotional reactions are actually coded messages from our own unconscious, revealing precisely where we still need healing and integration. Second, we understood the mechanism of shadow projection and how our irritation with others can be a precise map to our own unrecognized or unintegrated parts. Third, we explored the process of individuation, the Jungian path to emotional sovereignty through the integration of internal polarities that create conflict and fragmentation. Fourth, we discovered conscious breathing as a bridge between mind and body, and how this simple but powerful practice can interrupt the cycle of automatic reactivity. And finally, we learned the difference between reactivity and groundedness, and how to cultivate a state of anchored presence that allows us to remain stable even when provoked. As Jung so eloquently expressed, your problem is not the problem. Your reaction is the problem. When you truly internalize this truth, you free yourself from the emotional prison that kept you hostage to the words, actions, and opinions of others. True emotional freedom doesn't come from controlling the external world or suppressing your reactions, but from developing such an intimate relationship with all parts of yourself that nothing external can shake your center. If this video touched something in you, leave in the comments. I am not reactive, I am grounded. This will not only affirm your commitment to this practice, but also inspire others in their own journey to emotional freedom. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, do it now to continue exploring Carl Jung's deepest teachings on how to live a life of authenticity, meaning, and true emotional sovereignty. Until the next video, remember, your peace is too precious to be handed over to others.